Welcome, everyone, to the Center for Gender in Global Context March Colloquium on St. Patrick's Day. My name is Aminda Smith. I am the interim co-director for academic programs at the GenCen, and it is my pleasure to be introducing today's speaker. But first, I just have a couple of housekeeping tasks. One is that this is being recorded, just so that you're aware of that, and it will be available for people who'd like to watch it afterwards. Also, if you registered, which you did if you're here, you will receive a survey asking how you heard about the colloquium and what you gained from it. And we would really love it if you would respond, because we use that information for reporting our impact to our dean, but also for thinking about how we can better serve you and our other stakeholders as well. And Edwin will put a link to that in the chat. I see it there, and that will also go out via email. The other thing is that the great thing about the webinar format is that if you've got questions as we're going along, feel free to go ahead and put those in the Q&A. And we can start getting those, and we can then answer them when we get to the Q&A portion. But that way you don't have to remember your question. You can put it right in there. All right, so now it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker, and I am really delighted, in fact, to be able to introduce my friend and mentor, Ellen McCallum. Professor McCallum, who is professor of English and Film Studies here at MSU, wrote the books Object Lessons, How to Do Things with Fetishism, and Unmaking, the Making of Americans Toward an Aesthetic Ontology. Also co-edited the book After Queer Studies, Literature, Theory, and Sexuality in the 21st Century. Recent essays have appeared in Quarterly Review of Film and Video, Postmodern Culture, Camera Obscura, and Narrative. And in fact, a recent essay in Narrative titled Thinking Through Queer Narrative Forms with Ben Marcus and Renee Gladman was the winner of the 2022 James Phelan Award for Best Essay, again in the very prestigious journal Narrative. And the awards committee wrote in their announcement remarks that they found the essay bold, ambitious, and innovative. They loved how it brilliantly connects structuralist theory to queer theory and makes use of both large-scale theoretical critique and close reading in order to open up new ways of thinking about what narrative can do and be. So I would highly recommend that essay to everyone. The talk that Professor McCallum will give for us today comes from a current project that reexamines familiar concepts in classic film theory in light of recent insights from feminist new materialism, with a particular attention to the queer aspects of those theories. So take it away.
Thank you. That was a really marvelous introduction, Mindy. I'm just going to jump right in. And I should also share my screen. So let me go ahead and do that. As I do. Is it going to let me just go there? Yes, nice. All right. The intersection of the political and the ecological is a fraught juncture, one that is both necessary and inescapable. New materialism has been one of a series of responses to thinking critically through this intersection of politics and ecology, while recent materially oriented work in Black studies has framed the political explicitly in terms of race. As Kyla Wanzana-Tompkins has warned, there are reasons to be suspicious of new materialism, and she emphasizes how not necessarily new this materialism is. A non-human centered ontology and ethics, a sense of the biological and non-biological as vital and alive, the idea of a body as having a life and conversation of its own with itself, and most centrally and crucially, the idea that planetary life should be, must be, and should be, must be, and will be at the determinative center of political world making. These are political epistemologies and ontologies that can hardly be said to have been recently invented, she continues, but are rather familiar to, among others, First Nations and Indigenous people, those humans who have never been quite human enough, and some strands of feminist thinking or other non-Western medical and spiritual modalities. And yet, as Samantha Frost and Diana Kuhl write in their landmark introduction to their edited collection, New Materialisms, thinking anew about the fundamental structure of matter has far-reaching normative and existential implications. Tompkins advocates for how new materialist thought is and can profitably be put to work alongside those projects that have so far been absent from its considerations, namely the undoing of the subject and the category of the human, dissolving the atomic nature of the self by thinking through bodily affect as collective and social, ecological thinking that looks at the interdependence of species with others, and how politics traffics in mass feeling. On this latter point, I turn to Dana Luciano's observation that the most compelling contribution of the new materialisms is not conceptual or analytic, but sensory. Mindful of Tompkins' critique, I want to propose today a shift from a new to a critical or even queer materialism, developed through a reading of Mermaids. Mermaids figure the indissoluble relationship between humans and other species, a relationship that is not necessarily one of proximity, but of radically different worlds, terrestrial, marine. And mermaids also figure the marginalization of those who fail to fully actualize being human according to the very narrow parameters Western globalized modernity has set for ourselves. As completely imaginary figures, mermaids nonetheless mark a hyperbolic materiality of hybrid and dynamically morphing bodies. Indeed, the most familiar mermaid tale in modernity is probably Hans Christian Andersen's The Little Mermaid, which is all about failing to become fully human. It is a tale set at the juncture of the political and the ecological. Emily Parker defines a schism or a double bind in Western modernity, namely that the human and the body are expressions of a modern disjunction between that which is political and human and transcending of the bodily, and that which is precisely bodily and ecological. Because of this splitting apart, we inhabit a disconnection and even estrangement in the conceptualizing of the human from the world around us, a conceptualizing that also entails a very narrow understanding of the human, severing only certain persons into the category of human, while removing from the category of human any people who do not consider themselves in this fragmented relation to the world, or who have an entirely different relation between themselves and other beings in the world. The dilemma of this dominant way of modern thinking boils down to this, according to Parker. One needs to think ecologically, but this is politically problematic. One needs to think politically, but this is premised upon a variety of denials insofar as they conflict with the human. What Parker understands by human in this context is what Sylvia Wynter has so astutely called man. And indeed, Parker turns to Wynter as the necessary response to this dilemma, saying that her work offers a way of thinking about humanity not only as praxis, that is, as lived in a time and place, but also as a very sensory encounter. To be invested in the senses, to be invested in an encounter with the world in time, encounter in the world through the senses necessarily means to be bodied, to occupy a particular form of matter in time and space. It is necessarily a liminal experience, one that emphasizes connection and relation rather than severance, detachment, segregation. Man cuts up the world, separating out himself from fellow beings, be they other people who are relegated to the negation of the human in order to define the human, or other non-human beings, or matter. This morselization that I call the view from man emerged in the European Renaissance and Enlightenment. Its symptoms are a series of cuts, including the mind-body split, the schematic separation of reason from emotion, the privileging of the quantitative over and apart from the qualitative, and the radical separation of subjects from objects, which fuels the extractive approach of capitalist colonialism. This morselization is, I would argue, an infantile approach to the world, if we understand it in relation to Lacan's idea of the mirror stage, where the infant before the mirror experiences a corps morcelé, a body in pieces. It is not until the infant sees herself in the mirror that she begins to imagine connections among the disparate parts. Her whole body, reflected back to her, enables her to grasp that the hand that looms over her face is at the end of her own arm. Through this traversal into the imaginary, into a sense of connection, the infant then can proceed to enter into the symbolic order, the order of language and meaning, by individuating from the mother and using signs in the place of absent objects. In the moment before the mirror, the corps morcelé imagines having power over the pieces, projects a future mobility and autonomy. Through the process of the mirror stage, the body in pieces comes to form a subject that is still fundamentally cut. But like a film, that cutting is as much a cut together as a cut apart. The analogy to the film strip has made Lacan's mirror stage resonate strongly within film theory. The entry into the symbolic order, Lacan's story goes, marks our experience of the loss of full presence through our entry into language, which always falls short of capturing meaning completely, leaving our relations with others fraught with misrecognition and misunderstanding. While Lacan calls that cut that the subject experiences upon the entry into the symbolic castration, I'd call it rather a vivisection, a cut that takes us out of human life as hybridly biological and semiotic beings. In contrast to Lacan's account, I suggest man remains morcelé, in pieces, not yet able to envision or project a set of connections through the image in the mirror beyond the body. Lacan's account is typically understood as the development of individuation, coming into one's own autonomy as a subject. The jubilant assumption of his specular image by the child, Lacan says, at the enfance stage, still sunk in his motor incapacity and nursling dependence, would seem to exhibit in an exemplary situation the symbolic matrix. Here, the affective contrast between jubilation and the more negative connotations of sunk in motor incapacity and nursling dependence is what I want to mark. What if we reframe the mirror scene to understand an emerging sense of connection rather than severance as the source of that jubilation? What if the infant sees in the mirror image not just itself, but the rest of the world, the space around itself, that the image becomes a sighting of the self in the world, as well as generating an internal sense of self? What if the mirror stage were understood as a process of coming into relation? Lacan suggests as much, quote, the function of the mirror stage as a particular case of the function of the imago, which is to establish a relation between the organism and its reality, or as they say, between the Innenwelt and the Umwelt. Here too is a cut that relates. I turn to Lacan for how he offers a myth of origin, not a scientific lab result. Myths matter, and Wynter argues this. Indeed, the core of her work synthesizes mythos and bios, mounting an argument that humans, truly in the full range of their genres of being, are constituted as hybrid beings, through culture as much as nature, through mythos as much as bios. In a post-Darwinian era, man has scientificized himself as a biological organism severed from his environment, a severing that not only subordinates and arrogates matter and energy to man's dominance, but also, as Wynter argues, bioevolutionarily selects man and disselects other people, especially, she says, quote, all peoples of African descent who are wholly or partly thereby being, in consequence, law-likely inscripted as the ultimate boundary marker of non-evolved, disselected, and therefore barely human being. The origin myths of man are harmful to those cast outside of man, and yet we are all implicated in them. Where shall we look for myths that are not reparative, but generative? Wynter argues that no one, not even her particular case of African and African diasporic filmmakers, remains, quote, entirely freed from the functioning of these rules, and therefore from knowing and representing the cultural universe of Africa through the same Western gallery of mirrors which deform. Lacan's mirror stage has been an influential idea in film theory, especially theories of spectatorship that, like the mirror stage, hinge on identification. These are most widely known through Laura Mulvey's work, but Christian Metz, John Baudry, and others have talked about how spectatorial identification operates within the film system to create subjects and how viewers stitch together a sense of the whole from the film pieces. For a long time, identification was a central tenet in spectatorship theory, but that view has been challenged by others, whether it's Stephen Shafiro's model of masochistic spectatorship, or Bell Hook's analysis of Black female spectatorship, or Joan Kopchak's strongly Lacanian corrective. All of these approaches, however, fundamentally are interested in the question, where are we in the image? Where are we in relation to the image? I suggest that we use the reframing of a mirror stage to think about other possibilities of relation to the image or even with the image. What if we turn from an implicitly Cartesian subject-object relation between us, the subject, and the image, the object, to a more critically materialist relation with the image, understanding the image and cinema itself as integral to the web of matter we inhabit and that inhabits us? I know it might sound a little weird to say that an image inhabits us, especially from a material vantage, rather than an idealist one. But common sense acknowledges how images haunt us and shape our experiences and behavior in both good and bad ways. Wynter's vantage leads me to suggest there's a material relation to the image, to the pattern of photons arranged in the light of the screened image, animating our synapses. We need a critical materialism to envision more granularly how this works. For this, I turn to Wynter's film theory and one of her most explicit treatments of cinema, Africa, the West, and the analogy of culture, the cinematic text after man. Sylvia Wynter is not known as a film theorist, I will say. Film theory focuses on how cinematic representation works. It might seem obscure and maybe even obsolescent as a way of thinking about media. Yet a significant portion of canonical film theory includes work that has been written by filmmakers. Moreover, film theory has been crucial in many respects for considering how images matter to us as humans, how we are bound up in systems of meaning that are aesthetic, semiotic, and political. Film theory fundamentally embraces how we are constituted through techne, through the technology that we produce and deploy, and it also embraces the role of cinema as poiesis, a process of making. From there, we could slip quite readily to the kind of autopoiesis that Wynter discusses as constitutive of hybrid living human beings. We have to think about the terms of signification, the matter of how we represent, as much as who represents and to whom and what is represented. Man, Wynter argues, is overrepresented among the possible ways of being human. And man's dominance through that overrepresentation is secured by the biocentric appeal to an acultural view of the human as organism, a biologically bounded individual. Wynter layers the economic and the biological systems with the cultural systems in her assessment of man's formation and its consequences for those who are not man. In some ways, her approach resonates with how Kuhl and Frost denominate the layers of new materialism as rising from quantum physics, radical reappraisal of matter and energy, and its influence in organizing chemical and biophysical knowledge, leading to the innovations of biotechnology and biopower that then raise compelling ethical and political questions that we need critical social analysis to address. Where Kuhl and Frost focus on the recent ramifications of these sciences, Wynter extends our lens back to insist on the centuries of aggregation of knowledge and power to form man, and she calls for a new science. The biological paradigm obscures our apprehension of how humans are always a production of a specific culture, and that rather than there being one essential way to be a person, instead we become human by means of the conceptions, i.e. theories of being human that are specific to each culture. We are who we are, in other words, only because of our capacity to turn theory into flesh. This is Sylvia Wynter's film theory, I argue, which entails the formation of the human through cinema and its related representational apparatuses. Oops. The word flesh, I want to acknowledge, has a currency in Black studies coming out of Hortense Spiller's landmark essay, Mama's Baby, Papa's Maybe. And while there's a lively conversation and genealogy around that, for reasons of time, I'm going to have to set it aside. Instead, I want to focus on the interesting things that is happening with the way Wynter is using flesh. First, I'll explore those, and then I want to consider the intervention that Wynter makes in shifting the genealogy of the film image, and then in order to challenge the formation of the human, her view that cinema can generate other genres of the human. And finally, I want to bring this to bear on the lure. But let's start with flesh. Wynter uses the word flesh 5 times in her essay on cinema. Here's the full sentence in which this film theory first appears. Quote, "It is here, therefore, that the centrality of the human orders of representational apparatuses, including that of the cinematic text to our contemporary own, becomes apparent. For if, as Antonio de Nicola points out, we are enabled to live and actualize these conceptions of being human, and therefore to be conscious of, to experience being in their culture-specific terms, only because of our capacity to turn into theory into flesh and into codings in the nervous system, this process of transmutation can be effected only by means of the systems of representation in whose terms we are socialized as subjects, since it is these that function to tie us down metaphysically to each culture's criterion of what it means to be human." So first of all, the phrase in question, turn theory into flesh, appears in Wynter's gloss of de Nicola's writing, not her words, but his. His phrasing is, humans become through their powers of embodiment a multiplicity of theories that become human because man has the capacity to turn theory into flesh, end quote. The citation comes out of a review of a book by Alex Comfort, what I might call a minor genre of academic writing. The marginality of this genre matters, however, as I shall indicate. The repetition of only in Wynter's sentence, only because of our capacity to turn theory into flesh, only because of the means of system representation, aligns the ability to turn theory into flesh with how representations turn ideology into subjects. The comparison of the two phrases is marked by their tethering in this sentence through only, which serves to add a kind of urgency and restriction to the depicted operations, theory into flesh, systems producing subjects. The alignment heightens the contrast between a transubstantiation versus a more intangible process, idea moving to idea. The latter process recalls Lacan's mirror stage, the dialectic of becoming a subject, the intangible dialectic of becoming a subject, while the former denotes a conversion of idea into material, theory into flesh. Wynter's word, transmutation, is important. This word brings with it vestiges of alchemy, the conversion of base materials into gold, a use retained today in physics to mean the actual change of one element into another, especially by irradiation or bombardment. Transmutation also has meaning in biology of conversion or transformation of one species into another, specifically applied to the form of evolution or development propounded by Lamarck. The movement or change from one thing into something quite different, or from matter that behaves one way to matter that behaves another way, marks theory into flesh. The phrase is paired with de Nicola's cited words, codings in the nervous system, and that pairing reveals a slippage from what we might relegate as body to what is clearly mind. This slippage underscores a link between body and mind, as well as the materiality of the mind itself. The larger system of cultural codings is funneled into the smaller scale specific nervous system of an individual. This is a very materialist approach to thinking about human hybridity, emphasizing human life's permeability rather than its autonomy. Further into the essay, Wynter discusses at length how neurochemical processes of reward and punishment shape each of us within man's culture. So it's clear that for her, theory into flesh is a materially based process. Across this essay, the way Wynter scales between the micro, the neurochemical, and the macro systems of autopoiesis is amazing. At times, she seems to verge on new materialism's insistent that matter matters, has agency and vitality that must be taken into consideration. But Wynter's focus is more attuned to, in Thompson's words, the undoing of the subject and the category of the human. What is also striking to me about Wynter's idea of flesh is how closely she links it to consciousness. For as she notes, the struggles waged with respect to the issue of representation can be recognized as struggles over the modes of consciousness to which our contemporary secular belief system or ideology gives rise. Consciousness is the most pressing issue of the day. On the very same page I cited above, she has acknowledged that because of our common training in the view of man, our present understanding of man and its biologized conception of being human must law-likely block recognition of the issue of memory of consciousness as being the primary issue of our times. How we grapple with this apprehension of our relation to man, our positioning within man's episteme, is a core aspect of consciousness. The conclusion I want to draw from transmutation is how Wynter marks a synthesizing body and mind of materiality and consciousness. We live the ways of being human and come to be conscious of them only because we can turn theory into flesh. The work of transmutation suggests a way that operates beyond the system of representations, the networks of meaning that organize our relations to one another, that might go beyond a cut delimiting outsiders and insiders, or Innenwelt and Umwelt. Theory into flesh returns some pages later after a discussion of ancient rock drawings and circumcision initiations, privileging both of those as specifically African inscriptions of the human. Wynter moves to a close her reflections through a return to De Nicolas and the idea of flesh, theory into flesh. In this context, the institution of initiation based on the semantic charter or morphogenetic fantasy of the binary code of symbolic life, biological life, and the value principle enacted by its positive-negative series of representations can therefore be recognized as a central harmonizing mechanism by means of which what Antonio de Nicola defines as the transmutation of genetic into symbolic identity, of theory, the conception of being human, into flesh, is affected. I find notable here two things. First, that the word transmutation she now attributes to De Nicolas, although it is nowhere in his review. And second, the pithy process of theory into flesh is now interrupted by this parenthesis that seems to elaborate what she means by theory, the conception of being human. This explicitly marks consciousness, but at the same time, the choice of conception cannot but resonate with a simultaneous sense of human gestation. Both of these latter ideas are subordinated to transmutation, but I'll also note here that the change goes in an opposite direction to what we had seemed to have had before, from genetic or the micro scale now into the symbolic or macro scale, from the material into the ideal. This is the third instance of flesh appearing in her argument, and I suggest that this reversal marks her sense of there being a loop, that the process of becoming human is a dynamic and an individual permeability that is collectively instantiated and inscribed. If the harmonizing mechanism marks the emergence of humans from the animal world, it might also re-articulate theory into flesh. The question lurking here is whether the writing that makes and marks humans, writing that is definitively Derridean, necessarily engenders a binary and exclusionary form the way it does under man. So Wynter has been deep in the anthropological weeds to show basically that even traditional societies, quote, pivot on the same system of negatively, positively marked representations whose binary evil-good oppositions will be performatively enacted as the passage of disorder to order in the ceremony of symbolic birth that is foundational to traditional societies. How can we imagine otherwise? When, as Wynter lays out in detail, the system of negatively, positively marked continues to structure man's own rules, such that the systemic misrepresentation of Africa and peoples of African descent by both the Western cinematic text and the gallery of mirrors of contemporary scholarship is as law-likely affected as in the scholarship and religio-aesthetic system of Latin Christian Europe. The category of laity, and therefore of lay intelligentsia, had been negatively marked as the embodiment of symbolic death. The system is what needs to be disrupted in order for a cinema after man to emerge. How then can we free ourselves from our own subordination to the ontological rationale of man, to its symbolically coded gallery of mirrors and distorted yet rule-governed representations, she asks, before turning to rock paintings from Namibia in southern Africa, an image made some 28,000 years ago. Wynter's film theory aims precisely to shift the frame of representation from the margins. The function of the cinematic text, she argues, for the 21st century will be to move outside of this field of man, this conception, in order to redefine what it is to be human. How does she make this move? 1, cave painting. 2, the limits of man's autopoiesis. And 3, the possibilities of other aesthetics. For reasons of time, I'm only going to focus on the first. Shifting the scale to Paleolithic rock drawings not only reframes cinema in a trajectory rooted in Africa rather than Europe, but places our origins in representation rather than evolution, and thereby redefines the human outside the terms of its present hegemonic Western bourgeois conception as a purely bioeconomic being which pre-exists the event of culture and would, of course, call for a new poetics. In other words, because we become human through our symbolic systems, in order to change the human, we need a new poetics. There's a number of things that are important about this much longer scale reorientation of theory and history of moving images. 1, it takes us back literally to cave paintings as the origin of cinema. Not too far-fetched when you think of Jean Baudry's appeal to Plato's cave in theorizing the stillness of the spectator before the screen in his influential contributions to apparatus theory. If you don't think cave drawings move, you might want to reconsider whether film images move either, because of course they don't. The flickering light of the projector as still frame divided by still frame passes linearly through its illumination is not so far from the frameless flickering of the firelight by which cave paintings were viewed. My point is that both cave paintings and film strips convey movement, and moving images, a time-based representational medium, is central to what film is. They just do it on different scales. Apparatus theory argues that the centered perspective developed in the Renaissance continues to organize the cinematic image, which focuses light through a lens so that a three-dimensional experience becomes a two-dimensional plane projected through the lens onto a light-sensitive material that registers the image. The process is then doubled and reversed as the image is projected back through a lens onto a screen. When we teach apparatus theory, we haul examples of quattrocento perspective out to illustrate this for students. Apparatus theory argues that this process also ideologically centers the subject, while contestations to apparatus theory from feminist and Black studies direct critique that very subject as implicitly male, white, heteronormative, and in short, unmarked man. The liminal modes of spectatorship brought in by these critiques opened up a more dynamic range of ways for viewers to engage in cinema. Wynter's crafting of an alternative origin story for African cinema touches on some of the same considerations in French psychoanalytic film theory, but with the aim of embracing the liminal. It is only from the margins, from the liminal categories of the human, that anyone can begin to think otherwise. Putting African filmmaking in a lineage from rock drawings and flesh writing resituates not only the lensed box of the camera, but the human's relation to the non-human. How the images themselves establish and participate in relations with humans, with the systems of humans becoming in their various genres. It's not a simple relation, but a dynamic feedback loop linking the camera, the film, the filmmaker, the spectator, the technologies that mediate those relations. Wynter essentially asks us to consider how what I would call cinema's autopoiesis mediates us. To produce a cinema of aesthetic force and cultural integrity requires a new ground, a new science. In Wynter's terms, such ground necessarily moves outside the parameters of the memory of man, as the memory to which we are at present submitted. In other words, outside, she says, its understanding of our humanity. So to challenge man, we need this new science and we need this new cinema. Wynter proclaims the cinematic text, conceptualized in terms outside those of our present biocentric understanding, will be the quintessential genre of our now debiologized conception of the human. The medium, I propose, of a new form of writing which reconnects the writing of the rock paintings of Apollo Namibia some 30,000 years ago, and beyond that with the origin of the human in that first governing code of symbolic life and death. I want to return to the reframing of the mirror stage as a way of complicating what Wynter denotes the gallery of mirrors of Western cinema, with a look at a particular specular and speculative moment in the lure. But first, allow me to provide a little background on the film. Agnieszka Smoczynska's Polish mermaid horror musical, The Lure, rewrites the familiar tale of the Little Mermaid through an amazing genre pastiche that gives us not one, but two mermaids, Silver and Golden. They are taken in by a family who performs as a band in a nightclub and are integrated into the act as well as housed in the family's home. The mermaids sing beautifully, and the onstage gimmick of their transformation from leggy girls to fish-tailed mermaids folds profitably into the act. As you might expect if you're familiar with the Danish story, Silver falls in love with a human, the son Mitek, and wishes to be transformed from her half-fish mode into fully human. Her counterpart, Golden, takes a much different path, literally preying on men who she picks up at the bar, which is after all her nature, and being seduced by a female cop who's clearly out for fish, to put it in queer slang terms. Golden is an opportunist, fine with being taken in by this family band for a while, but also keen to move on at some point. She embraces her mermaidness, her human animality, while Silver's quest to assimilate rejects her own animality, a rejection that is a mimetic formation, seeking to become man, even though Mitek has told her, "I'll always see you as a fish." Her abjection of her animality is congruent with the abjection of the animal under the regime of man. The mimetic part is important because what this film is able to show about the marginalized and the non-man is decipherable largely from the liminal vantages of the queer, of hybridity, of the indirection of the non-mimetic. If the mirror stage is reframed as a coming into relation with others, then this scene before the mirror, some 18 minutes into The Lure, establishes the narrative and specular relations that organize this film. We cut to a realist narrative to this realist narrative scene from a very high energy music video bit, which ended with Silver spinning herself into a fall, literally falling over Mitek, Mitek bending over her with concern, and Golden looking on in horror. There's a big transition from light to dark, from close-up of Mitek touching Silver's body, bloody nose as she shyly looks up to him, clearly sparked by his attention, to this wider medium shot of two mermaids before the dressing room mirror as Mitek enters from the left, the same place he was situated in the previous sequence. I'm going to play this, see if this goes, or do I have to hit play? So here's the clip.
Dziewczyny, bardzo was proszę, zasłaniajcie się trochę, jak śpiewacie.
It's not letting me move on. Oop, okay. What we see here is in fact 5 figures. We see Golden's reflection on the far left, Silver's reflection in the center, and Metek's reflection crossing the space between them, while the 2 mermaids in actuality are on the far right, with Silver foreshortened and largely hidden behind Golden. Our attention is focused on the image in the mirror, and the mirror's wrap around the corner behind the sitting mermaids further disorients us in this space. There's only a small sliver of non-reflecting wall. This is a scene of mimesis and doubling. The mermaids are preparing for their first performance, projecting their entry into the world of the stage and chatting about future plans. As Metek coolly crosses to reach between them for a light for the cigarette ruchely dangling from his lips, we see a complex exchange of gazes before the mirror. Golden eyes Metek as he inserts himself between the mermaids. Metek looks down, searching for the match, and cued by his presence, Silver glances up at him and then coyly down, pretending to ignore him, while Golden continues her obsessive gaze. The camera moves in, ethereal music starts on the soundtrack, and Silver and Metek share a look in the mirror. His leaning in towards her frames them as a couple, while Golden's facial and body language is having its own separate conversation on the left side of the screen. Metek rights himself, moving his actual body out of the frame and leaving his headless image in the mirror, coolly confident of his move. In the space left by his removal, the mermaids' gazes seem to meet. Golden still looks critical, Silver vulnerable. We cut to a medium close-up of Golden with a slow zoom in to get a bit tighter. The mimesis and doubling happen on the soundtrack as well as the visual track. I mentioned the ethereal music, which cues us into another dimension opening up. But what we also hear is the call of marine mammals, whales maybe, or dolphins, as the film's, and this happens as the film's grammar switches to a kind of reverse shot pattern that conventionally marks conversation between 2 speakers. The mermaid's marine speech is subtitled for us, but Metek is oblivious to it. The scene ends with a sound that brings us into the human world as the lead singer matriarch, Chrysia, calls girls, and we cut to her at the dressing table. I said it was a kind of reverse shot, and by that I want to underscore that in the shifting between Golden's medium close-up and Silver's medium shot, what we see primarily is their reflection in the mirror. It's a mediated and layered view. The zoom isolates each mermaid and cuts between them, as Golden asks teasingly, does Silver want to hang out here? Tracking Metek in the mirror as he crosses behind her and clears the space between the mermaids. We cut to a longer shot of Silver, isolated in the mirror, but offsides we can still see Golden's actual head in the right of the frame. It becomes increasingly obscure, but it's still there as the camera moves in. As Silver reaches for something near Golden on the dressing table and says, sure, she then averts her gaze. As she opens her lipstick, Golden addresses her, Silver, and we cut back to Golden, closer in, as she asks, what if you fall in love? It's a frontal shot of Golden, but her eyes are directed sideways at Silver, emphasizing their shared space, their relationality. Cut to Silver in medium shot, nearly frontal, and looking directly at us from the mirror. She closes her eyes as she pauses as the camera zooms in, then looks up again directly forward to say, don't be silly. This gaze is coming at us from the mirror, unlike Golden's gaze directed in real space. Cut to Golden, still side-eyeing, would you eat him? Cut to Silver, a closer shot than before, but not quite as close as Golden's. She looks away as we hear Chrysia address them, interrupting their conversation and resubordinating non-human language for the human exchanges. This is much like how the images in the mirror dominate over the bodies in the glass. The technique of reverse shot, as I said, is usually used conventionally to link characters who are not in the same shot together, but in the same diegetic space, for example, opposite each other. It's a pattern of cutting that creates a sense of whole, of togetherness. The illusion of continuity between the two gives audiences a sense of logical and spatial connection, and that sense hinges on their looks, say one looking to the left and the other looking to the right. Here, though, the relentlessness of Golden's gaze on Silver, never directly forward at either herself or at us, and broken only by tracking Mitek's image moving out of the mirror, contrasts with Silver's dispersed gazes, looking at Mitek, whose removal leaves her looking at Golden, then her repeated looking away, mixed in with looking at us. Once the camera zooms in from the group shot, we only see the mermaids in the mirror. The misalignment of their gazes works narratively, of course, to illuminate the disjunction of their goals, leaving versus staying, remaining mermaid versus becoming human. And it defines the plot conflict as which relationship will triumph, the mermaids or the romance. But it also messes with cinematic convention, playing with whether what we see is real before the camera or a reflection, an image of an image. The layering of images here, the disorienting definition of the space, even in the establishing shot that anchors all the relations before and in the mirror, defines the imaginary and the symbolic as multiple, stitching together disparate worlds: marine, nightclub, animal, human. The mirror holds the relations of the mermaids, vividly capturing their human-animal hybridity, marking the effort it takes to become girls, to reproduce humanness for this act, and most importantly, marking Golden's steady connections with Silver in the face of Silver's dispersive oscillation between directness and evasion. Notably, her directness is at us, implicitly the human spectators, and not at her fellow mermaid, except as mediated through the mirror. That reproduction of humanness through the mirror is both bodily and linguistic. Curiously, the mermaids are kind of fluent in Polish. Their biological hybridity resonates in their bilingualism. And while they seem to have picked up one of the less dominant human languages, this is remarked only briefly when a nightclub manager asks them where they learned Polish. Answer: on a beach in Bulgaria. Are the mermaids fluent in all human languages, or do they specialize? The mermaids' communication in their fishy language, on the other hand, is subtitled. It's right alongside the English translations of the Polish. So that produces an interesting effect. I don't know how it works for Polish viewers, but for everyone else, there's a kind of equation between the non-human and the human languages that you might not have in the Polish. But the question is, what is lost in these translations? One thing that's lost is the question of race. Why are these mermaids white is not unrelated to why are these mermaids speaking Polish. The mimetic aspect of their human traits is significant. What does a human look like? The whiteness of these mermaids reads as a play for likeness or likability, to render themselves more desirable, more human to man, and less, well, fishy. Who or what is desirable is delimited by man's episteme. Conventionally, mermaids come to be desirable primarily for their human form, including their singing talent, which registers as human activity, like enough to be relatable. Their hybrid animality might lend a whiff of exoticism or fetish, but it's their likeness to humans that makes them desirable. That human likeness is racialized as well as gendered, and it reveals a risky mimesis, one that conceals or disavows difference as if that will diminish harm. Whiteness undergirds Silver's desire to become human, insofar as it affords at least some point of contact with privilege and not otherness. Whiteness allows for the humans to recognize the mermaids as like enough to take a liking to, or kin enough not only to be taken in under one's roof, as any pet animal or stray youth might, but to be married, and thereby to be brought into the center of man's culture, legitimated with a place in the logos. The film critically engages whiteness here as a vehicle for greater understanding and deconstruction of the category of man and its hybridity. Mitek's refusal, ultimately, of the surgically human Silver follows on an earlier refusal by the family of the mermaids when they went and cast them out of the house violently disposing of them by tossing them from a bridge into a river about an hour into the film. From that moment on, the human unravels. You can't get rid of mermaids by throwing them in the water. They know where to find the family and return to them in the dressing room. Sylvia's surgery ensues soon after that, but neither she nor the family will be whole as they are split apart by the father's adultery, Sylvia's loss of voice, and Metek's turning from Sylvia to marry another woman. It is through hybridity and queerness and animality that the film suggests some other genres outside of man, as well as some other modes of desire and desirability, all counterpoints to the devastation that wreaks man in the last third of the film. The sanctity of marriage, domestic tranquility, adulation of audiences, and the cohesive profitability of the band are all shattered. The film's excesses, which at the outset were joyously exuberant, become sensory overload as the affects turn from the vivacious to the vivisectional. The high-energy MTV music video we had at the beginning shifts to a moody and melodramatic intercutting of Sylvia's surgery and Golden's moping around the house. Something is off, diegetically and tonally speaking. This lively switching from thriller to musical to domestic drama of the film's earlier genre pastiche settles into a more singular and realist narrative. And in that taming of genre, the diminishment of the sensory stimulation into quiet and irrevocable collapse, the liminal vantage on man's gallery of mirrors comes into sharper focus, looming like Golden's dark head as a real presence before the mirror. A sharper presence, but looming like Golden's dark head as a real presence before the mirror, but not yet coming into focus. What Sylvia Wynter's film theory tells us is that the terms of representation have to change. Even if the lens and the camera organize depicted space in the quattrocentro terms, who's behind the camera and the aesthetic traditions they are ensconced in matter. It is not simply a matter of putting an identity behind a camera in the mise en scène or in the production, but a question also of what theory is being made into flesh, what theory is being fleshed out on screen, and how that genetics shapes differently the horizon of the human, the genres that we take to be human. Queer forms, Black plasticities, and fishy disruptions matter. Aesthetic takes us back to the sensory, which is both what Wynter's film theory and new materialism have to offer. Can we accept the challenge of a new aesthetics and its concomitant genres of the human? Can we do so by beginning to see things that, like Golden herself, resist being captured by the lure of man? The beginning and end of the film, what lures us in and lures us away from this diegetic world of man, marks another way, a marine way, alongside the rock art way that Wynter delineates, to be thinking about other genres, horror, musical, Polish, or polished. Thank you.
Thank you. So we have time for questions and discussion. So please feel free to put your questions in the Q&A. Or is it also possible for people to raise their hand and be unmuted, Edwin?
Yes, that is possible.
Okay, so you can also raise your hand if you would like to ask a question. Yes, Jyotsna. Edwin, can you unmute? Oh, I can. Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
It's absolutely wonderful, brilliant talk. That's what I always learn from Ellen. Thank you. And, you know, I love the layers and I loved what you did with new materialism, about which I have to read. I've used Sylvia Wynter in other Shakespearean things, but this is an essay I don't know. But I have a question specifically about her use of the cave paintings and how she's using, you know, a new lineage for African cinema and is going to them. And I wanted to sort of push a little, because cave paintings are also labeled as the primitive in so many aesthetic appropriations of art. And second, in cave paintings, what happens to the bodies and the sensory? Because that was a strain that you had throughout. And so drawing from that, it gives a different location, from the Western global, but kind of where do you go with that? I just thought that was very tantalizing, but I would, just your thoughts on, what kind of connected histories there are between cave paintings and African cinema. Just your thoughts on where you can go with that.
So the first most important thing about the paintings that she references, which she calls rock paintings, but she does say that they were found in a cave in Namibia. But the most important thing is that they're African, and she's situating them as the emblem or the mark of how humans separated out from animals, because they are the ones leaving these marks, making these images. And so the very idea that we become human because of our theory into flesh, the cave paintings are a mode of theory that then creates and distinguishes humans from the animal world. And so that's the homo inscriptive mechanism that she talks about. So that's the first thing. It's shifting it away from a European trajectory of art into a much longer African trajectory, and claiming the Africanness of it. And the cave paintings are paired with her discussion, which is a little briefer, about circumcision, which is a writing of the flesh. And in fact, that's the second time that she uses the word flesh in the essay, is talking about circumcision as a writing of the flesh. And so she's looking to what cultural practices do we know of as being African, and drawing on that to get into how we might change how we're thinking about what the origin of images is. The one I picked, image of the rock, to me, that is a really interesting image because of the way the images, it's an interesting photograph, an interesting example, because of the way the rock images kind of flow across the surface of the rock. It's almost like a tattoo of a body. It felt very dynamic, just as I was looking at the different rock images that are, on the internet. So I want to be thinking about how the materiality of the rock comes into play in the representational space of these rock paintings, and how that's different from how we might think about it from man's point of view, as like we have a very strong sense of figure versus ground. And you look at these paintings and they don't have a horizon, they don't have a frame, they organize the figures on there very differently than we might organize them. There is not necessarily a center. And some of the other ones that I could have used have kind of layers of different figures. Some are white, some are red, some are black, some are a little bit multicolored. And it looks like they might have been inscribed at different times, but we can't tell. So but the way that those images are not operating on a plane, not operating on a flatness, but operating on a much more dynamic surface is part of what I want us to be thinking about in this move, in following Wynter on this move to think about those images as anchoring cinema.
Ellen, can you see there are a couple of questions in the chat?
Mm-hmm. How I'm going to expand this work. Well, a lot of this is coming from the introduction. The relationship of Sylvia Wynter to new materialism is how I want to frame the book. A third piece of this is the work of Karen Barad, who brings in a lot more strongly the sense of queerness, because she is they are bringing in this idea of quantum materiality as inherently queer, as marking the universe itself as inherently queer, and disrupting identity because of that. And so what do we do when we start thinking from that quantum vantage point? So other parts of the book include an essay or a chapter on Barad as apparatus theory and how that compares to contemporary apparatus theory. There's a piece of that was out in Postmodern Culture. the final chapter is going to come back to the lure and really work through the materiality of the mermaids. There's way more that I have to say about this, especially in terms of the film's form and the way that it's cutting together all these different genres. It's very strange formally, I think, this film. I saw that Robin had said she's going to have to go watch this film. And I think everybody is like amazing and weird. But the way that it jumps across different musical genres and the way that it uses musical episodes against sort of thriller-esque episodes against actual horror, bloody necks, torn open kind of things. The way that Golden, when she preys on the man, she picks this guy up at the bar and goes in a car and rips his throat out when they're parked at some nice lake overlook, some romantic makeout spot, and she just rips out his throat and heart and chews on it and then slithers away as her mermaid form. And you kind of go, so was that a murder or was that just predation? And if it's predation, is she guilty? Right. So it raises these questions that we need to grapple with or think about in terms of how we're defining what's human and what's not human, because the film is kind of taking this interesting viewpoint of displaying man under attack from taking in those mermaids. I don't know if that answers your question, Steph, but excess. All right. Would you read Divya's question, Mindy?
Yeah. So, Ellen, your talk was really so compelling. I'm thinking about your phrase hyperbolic materiality as well as dynamic morphing. And I'm hearing both excess and rapid and unpredictable change in the description of character growth in the lure. And I'd like to hear you think about this along the material of the voice and the dematerialized telepathic communication between Silver and Golden. How are materiality of the voice and dynamic morphing of communication styles related in this shift in media from vocalization to telepathic communication? Does it allow us to understand something about mer subjectivity, which seems to move beyond the translation, which seems so quaintly and limitedly human in the context of the film's notion of plurilingualism?
So I want to start by saying they don't communicate telepathically. They communicate through marine mammal calls, and the way that it was a little hard to hear on this soundtrack because the ethereal music is keyed to those kinds of calls, and it's a little hard to discern whether it's an electronically generated or a tape of actual marine animals. I haven't found that out yet. But it is clear to me from watching the scene multiple times that there is supposed to be a distinction between the voices of the mermaids and the sound of the music. So it's playing with those things. We see the voices again, or hear the voices again in other scenes, particularly when Golden is picking the guy up at the bar. She's in female form and she walks up and this guy's sitting there and she looks at him and then she keeps looking at him and she never says anything verbally to him, but you hear the marine calls again on the sea mammal calls on the soundtrack, and he talks to her and it doesn't seem to bother him that she doesn't talk back, and then he leaves with her, right? So there's like this whole negotiation where she's silent, almost the ideal woman, right, under man, and he's doing all the talking and therefore thinks he's great and we're going to move on to the next level, and he just kind of has having this I can't believe my luck kind of moment. So there is a persistence of their call that is material, and it is happening. I don't know that it's hyperbolic. I think there's other film things about this text that are hyperbolic. The visuals are incredibly sensual. The shot that I had of Silver's surgery, that's like right at the beginning of the surgery. There's this, they found some human donor, so they're going to just switch the tail from Silver onto the other woman and the woman's legs onto Silver. And I can't myself actually watch this entire sequence. I'm like watching it like that. And, you know, they show it stitching up. It's very literal. And I really appreciate the literalness of the excessiveness of the mermaid's tails. They're so much longer than you might have thought. But when you work it through, you know, from a kind of more biological perspective, it kind of makes sense that something that has a human-sized upper would be a pretty large fish. So, but there is a kind of excess nonetheless to the fishy tails. They are so much bigger when they're mermaid. And you might wonder, how does the new mermaid get out of there? I'm not entirely sure how she gets out of the surgery. We don't really follow her or care. But the visuals, the darkness of the image often is excessive. As you could see towards the last two images I showed, the first image was the view of the family on the beach at the very beginning, as before we even know the mermaids are looking at them. We see them coming up through the water, so it's a view from the water, and it's kind of excessively dark. We've been coming in through waves, and you only see glimmers of light caught in the water. So the beginning of the film can be very disorienting as we move into the story. And then once the mermaid head pops above the water, we see the family on the beach, and everything is kind of put in human terms. So there's a very interesting play with levels, with, you know, what's normal, what, you know, because once we see them on the beach, it's just kind of low key and realist. And then there's a cut to a vivid disco ball scene with Chrisia singing, you know, this very upbeat, happy disco music. So it's constant shifting between bright and dark, between loud and quiet, between happy and upbeat, and sad and dolorous. So it's constantly shifting gears.
Stephanie is asking recommendations for readings on quantum materiality.
Oh, well, definitely Karen Barad. They have a book called Meeting the Universe Halfway that I think is really good. And then it's just like a whole bunch of, I mean, it depends on which direction you want to go. Do you want to go to the multiverse? Read Sean Carroll's The Something Deeply Hidden, which is about the way that that some theories of physics say that we're splitting, you know, that every decision point splits into a new universe, and a lot of the dark matter that we now understand as part of our universe could be the pressure of other universes. This would be the book you would read also to watch Everything Everywhere All at Once. That's written by a physics person. I like Carlo Rovelli's work a lot. He's very clear he's done a whole series of books, like one called Reality Is Not What It Seems. That's thinking, you know, about the ways in which physicists are conceptualizing the quantum levels and what some of those implications might be. Another one I like is Amir Axel's Entanglement, which is specifically oriented towards the question of entanglement, which is where you have two elements that are split apart, and they could be miles apart, and what you do to one thing, the other one reacts. And it's what Einstein called spooky action at a distance. I can give you lots more. There's another book called Existential Physics by Sabrina somebody or another. It's not coming to me just yet, but it's very interesting.
Thank you, Ellen. I will dip my toes in this and then get back to you when I'm on sabbatical and have time to dig into this.
Yes, great sabbatical reading.
Okay.
Let's see. Should I read these to you in order, or do you want to look at them and see?
Yeah, no, it'd be really helpful if you could just moderate them, because
Yeah, okay. So
otherwise I'll sit here open-mouthed.
that's right. So Serena says, well, first of all, I have a totally different understanding of the Disney casting of the new Little Mermaid, which is interesting. And then goes on to say, this is also making me think of Eric Santer's reading of Jacques-Louis David's famous painting, The Death of Marat, 1793. Another moment of visual figuration and a major theoretical shift of the genre of the man. Your reading of the film suggests something on that order, of that shift and stresses on democratic representation, and then says, I'm wondering how Wynter might inform Santner's take, which is devoid of consideration of race or biologization.
I love Eric Santner's work, but I have not read that, or if I have, it was a while ago. It was a minute. Is this in the King's Two Bodies book? Because that was really awesome. And Serena, yeah, okay, King's Two Bodies, yes, because it's coming back to me vaguely, but I can't speak intelligently on it. But now I'm going to have to go read that. So I can't answer that question.
Yeah, that sounds great. Yunzo is asking about whether or not they're called gold and silver for specific reasons.
I don't know. I mean, certainly golden is darker and silver is lighter, and so there's that kind of thing. But I don't really have a theory about that. I mean, certainly you could make connections to those as minerals that are part of extractive capitalism, and there's a role that their participation in the band plays that's very capitalist, because the family is what causes the family to dump them in the river is the girls start fighting, and then they accuse the family of not paying them, and they get into this whole thing like, you're just you're keeping us like pets, or and they're like, no, we're keeping you like children. And that's sort of the hinge of the debate, is like, we're paying for everything for you, and so we're taking the money from the band. A lot of it is a question about the age of the mermaids, because when they first come in, the nightclub owner is like, what are you doing with these underage people in here? And the father is like, oh no, they're mermaids, see, look, and he pours water on them and the tail emerges. And that's where the early pictures that I had of the mermaids came from. And so there's this interesting sort of pedophilic thing going on that the film is also questioning and negotiating or highlighting. And then when it's clear that silver is of an age that's dateable for Metek, then that concern sort of shifts. So there's an age thing that's constantly in flux with them as well. And you also have to wonder, are they really as young as they look, right? Because they're not human, they're monsters. Maybe they're, in fish years, how old are they? So I think there's some extractive aspects of their relation to the family, capitalist extractive aspects, that is partly signaled by the names silver and golden, the fungibility of that money.
So Joshua Lamb says, I love this consideration of the mermaids of the lure as alternatives of the human outside beyond man. How does monstrosity, as one of the rhetorical tools used to police the borders of man, come into this discussion? I'm thinking about the violence and abjection of the mermaids and how they might fit into the framework of the monstrous feminine. Could you talk about how the film's approach to genre, especially horror, though overall the film is clearly also hybridized via pastiche, helps these issues come into view? And then says, you started to answer this and or talk a little bit about this while I wrote the question, so you can expand maybe.
Yeah, I mean, because it's not committed to any one genre, it's a little harder to read this through Barbara Creed's monstrous feminine idea. What I'm interested in with the monstrosity of these mermaids is the question of how does their monstrosity conceal the monstrosity of man? And the monstrosity of man is really, one could say, anchored in the reading that Hortense Spillers gives of flesh, because that comes out of the degradations of the Black body under slavery and the violations and the markings, the scarring, that, and in her discussion of that and talking about the turning of the slave body into flesh, that has been so generative for a lot of really interesting, really recent Black thinking. So Spiller's idea of the flesh is ensconced in the violence of slavery, and Wynter's idea of flesh in this essay is not, I think. So in a longer version of this, I'd like to try to think through how those meet through the question of monstrosity and whose monstrosity is visible, whose monstrosity is not visible.
Okay, and then Nithya Balakrishnan asks, feeling like I'm back in your Film Theory 381 class, talking about the non-human along with this movie, bringing in Wynter in this theorizing of the shift away from man, brings to mind theories of abjection as well, when thinking of the porous boundaries of the body. The monstrous feminine speaks to this. IMO.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really great observation. It's funny because they're not, I mean, the abjection is certainly Silver's own self-hatred, and the way that the surgery is shot is very much about the flesh and the blood, and there's a kind of embrace of that abjection and a hyperbola, making it sort of hyperbolically abject because it's so red, the blood. It is just, it's cartoon red, right? So I'm going to have to think more about the role of abjection there, because they're so kind of forcefully coming from the margins, and the drive of Silver is to assimilate into being man, and the drive of Golden is to go back to the sea and to embrace her mermaid life. But that's not abjection. Abjection is still, I mean, to be a mermaid and to be in the sea is still to be a creature, to have form. It's just not to have form under man. So the way that might give us a sense of how the film is shifting lenses without us paying attention to can be seen through the question of abjection. So that's really good. Thank you.
I have a question, which is kind of about, I kept getting stuck on that. I'll always think of you as a fish or whatever that what's his name says, right? And I was trying to think about like what that means in terms of where you're delineating the differences between humans and other kinds of beings, right? Like, what is it that means that somebody would always be a fish? Because I think maybe even in man's conception, there might be ways to become human, right? Certainly there are like evolutionary ones, but maybe that's the only one. I don't know. Or maybe there's not. Maybe there is no way to become human, right? But in thinking about that, I was then thinking about this operation, right, of becoming human and what that sort of might mean. And at first, when looking at the image that you had, I thought they like somehow got her in her human state, took her legs, and then sort of got her back into her mermaid state and put the legs back on. But no, they took somebody else's legs. But so then she has both a human form, she has her human part, and she has somebody else's human part. So like, you know, how do you always be a fish, right? So I wonder a little bit more about like that scene and like what's going on, to kind of expand on what is it that makes someone human such that it's a surgical intervention, yet this guy does not accept that as making somebody human. She's still a fish, right?
And that actually does get to an abject moment, because the one time that Metek and Silver try to get it on is a little too soon after her surgery, and so the blood from her wounds opens up again, and so he steps away from her, kind of disgusted because there's this blood on him, and there's an interesting way in which I think the film is doubling the surgical blood and the menstrual blood, so which maybe Silver doesn't know about menstruation because she's not been human, right? Did that part come with the legs, right? Because when they're in their human form, they don't have, it's just solid. And this is shown to us at the beginning with the pedophilic moment of, pedoscopophilic moment of the nightclub manager being shown by the father that this is, look, they're not really girls. They're not underage. It's okay. They're mermaids. Right. But back to so he says, I'll always think of you as a fish fairly early on, right? This is before they get to be an item. And you think in some sense, it's just fueling the plot, because we have to have the conflict before we can, that's going to be what has to be overcome. She has to convince him she's not a fish. That's so in a conventional plot, that's what that is. But at the same time, because this film is so excessive and so kind of excessively literal, I always think of you as a fish is also a hugely misogynistic statement. And there's nothing you can do as a woman to become man. There's nothing you can do as a woman. You will always be this abjected, marginal, not fully like me, always slightly different and lesser. And it's just like, why would you even go for a guy that says that? But
Yeah, and there's like a out for fish, always a fish. There's kind of a pairing there of
Yeah.
two. Thank you. So Yoon in the chat says, yes, the names are so interesting to me. I think as minerals, it is also interesting that the mermaids as creatures between human and animal are given the names of minerals. In this case, it seems that the boundaries between human and animal and object or material are blurred. Gold and silver are also special in many cultures, not only as they are used in currency, they also remind me of timelessness and the idea of eternity.
Yeah. I'm just thinking now, like there's animal, vegetable, and mineral, and I guess the vegetables are kind of left out of this, but I like that there's a real interest by the film in the materiality of the mermaids and what they look like, how they manifest. That close up of becoming mermaid. I wish I had the clip because it's just this pan down Silver's body as she turns and she's physically turning, and then she's turning into a mermaid, and then we get a wider shot with Golden's legs or Golden's fishtail, flopping. So I think there's something interesting going on in terms of how the film might be disrupting our subject-object distinction that I haven't yet fully thought through, but I like your prodding to give that more thought. Thank you.
And then Nicole McLeese says, the discussion of fish as a form in a hierarchies of forms is reminding me of Louise Erdrich's Future Home of the Living Gods and her speculative disease that is reversing creation.
All right, now we're going to have to talk more about that because.
Well, let me read you another comment. There's one more comment and question, and you can respond. So this is from Masha Boone, and it is, thank you for this incredibly rich and generative talk. I enjoyed it immensely. I love your reading of the film, and I am tantalized to see the lure ASAP, as are we all, right? We need to have a film viewing now. But my question is more theoretical and pertains to the concept of transmutation in relation to your reworking of the mirror stage, functioning not as a cut that separates, but as a mark of entering into relationality, as a cut that cuts together, just as editing slices film together. And as perhaps Barad's agential cut also intraconnects. How would, as Wynter paraphrases de Nicolas, the transmutation of genetic into symbolic identity into flesh relate to this more relational aspects of the mirror stage? And thank you again for your talk and the great discussion.
First of all, you're absolutely right that there's a Baradian idea of the cutting together apart haunting this talk. I just didn't have time to bring that in as fully as I would like. So, but thinking about the question of transmutation, what I want us to see it do for us in the mirror stage, in rethinking the mirror stage, is that the theory into flesh brings us back to the problem of the mermaids before the mirror. Who do we see? Who is the image and who is the real? Who is the material? Who are the photons being like the image, the photon, the reflection from the mirror is light, whereas the Golden's head in front of the mirror is literally dark, but also substance, matter. So we have matter and energy in exchange and being brought together through this mirror stage. And if we think about that through theory into flesh, then we're thinking about how this works as a transmutation of the object before the mirror, the figure before the mirror, into the mirror image, and then back out into the flesh before the mirror. I think that should answer your question.
Thank you.
So it's that connection that you get through that transmutation.
Yes, thank you. This has been fascinating. Do we have a well, we're pretty much at time, actually. I was going to say we have a minute, but we really don't. This has been a really, really fantastic discussion. I've enjoyed even getting to read these aloud. It made me feel like I was just, becoming smarter just by asking, other people's questions to you. So Thank you to everyone. Do you have any final thoughts you'd like to leave us with, Professor McCallum?
No, just go see the lure and enjoy it this weekend. Yeah.
Yeah, good idea.
But thank you all for your questions. Really, very grateful.
Wonderful. Well, thank you everybody for attending. Thank you, Professor McCallum, for this wonderful talk. Please don't forget to take the survey. There is a link in the chat and it will be emailed to you as well to let us know what you like about these